we are still on AWS. This time around, we want to look at a service within the networking and content delivery domain, and that is the VPC. VPC is virtual private cloud, right? So by default, what do I have? I have one VPC, right? Let's see all the regions, right? I have one VPC. I have 6 subnets. I have one route table, and I have one internet gateway. Okay, now, how does this VPC, how does it work? How should we best explain it? Okay, I want to look at the cloud as a vast expanse of land, right? And of all this vast expanse of land, you can buy a portion of it, right? You can buy a portion in a certain location or decide to buy it in another location. Now, so when you buy the land, right? Let's assume you are a billionaire, you are trying to put up skyscrapers, right? You can decide to buy the land and put up that building. Once you have this building, right, you want to use it for building an office, right? So once you have this building can be seen as a VPC because it's private to you. It is within that building you are going to have your structure set up, right? Now, the building is your VPC, right? Your VPC in the cloud, right? That is where you are going to create all your infrastructure. But before you start creating infrastructures and all of that, you want to set up within your building, you want to create 2 parts, right? You want to say, oh, this part of the building, the public can come in here, right? Maybe the lower, let's say you are having a 20-floor building, right? So you can say the bottom 10th floor, we can use that to accommodate visitors, people coming to operations, people coming to get business done. They can come to the lower 10 floors, right? So that lower 10 floors, you can call that like a public area, right? Where you have the operations department, you have the marketing department, you can have accounting, right? Finance, you can have operations, you can have marketing, you can have accounting, right? At this lower floor. Then at the top floor, you want to have the boardroom, the server room, if you have some infrastructure on-prem, on the premise, right? You can have server rooms, you can have your vault, and you can have maybe finance, right? Strategic finance up there, okay? So now you have this, your building, right? Your VPC divided into 2 parts, right? You have the public area and you have the restricted area at the top. The restricted area at the top is like the private VPC, right? The private subnet, sorry for the confusion. So now within your VPC, you have the subnets, right? So the subnets, you have the top level, right, which you call the private subnet, and the lower level, which you call the public subnet, right? So the subnets are like divisions within the building, right? Where you can separate from private to public, okay? So this restricted area is the private area, that's the private subnet, and the public area, the lower level, is the public subnet. So now, let's relate this to what we've covered so far, right? when we're looking at app servers, we say app servers at the back end, right? While we have the web servers at the front end. So the web servers, I expect that they will be in the public subnets. Whereas the app server, because they are backend servers, they will be in the private subnets. So it's like the private server is in the restricted area of your building, right? While the web servers, right, is in the public area of your building, right? So private subnet, public subnet. Okay. So now that we've established this, we should also realize something. Now, the public area, there's need for us to also manage how people come in and go out into the building. So you need to have some people at the reception, right? So you have a reception in the building. So the reception, I want to see the reception as the internet gateway. Okay, we've looked at the VPC here as a building. We've looked at the subnet as the different divisions within the building, the restricted area and the public area. And we've looked at the reception, right? The reception area where we manage the way people come in and go out as the internet gateway. This will also include the phone resources, intercom, and all of that within the building, right? So all of that, we want to look at them as the internet gateway. Because when somebody comes into the building, the person either is an employee or a visitor. So the employee already has access cards, right? To go to where he's going, to his office and all of that. And the visitors will need to get some kind of tag, the visitors tags, right? To be able to go to certain places within the building. So it is receptionists that coordinates this from the reception, right? So for the visitors, they go through the reception to get across where they are going to, right? And there will be phone calls made from the reception and all of that, right? So we want to see the reception and the resources there as the internet gateway, okay? Internet gateway. Now, route table. So route table determines access, how traffic are routed, right? Within the building, right? So the route tables, I want to see the route tables as those tags, the access cards to get into certain areas within the building. So access cards are like the route tables, asset cards. The route tables are like the access cards, internet gateway, the reception and the resources used at the reception, and the subnets are those components, right? Those divisions within the building, while the building itself is the VPC, okay? So now, since we've looked at this, let's look at how we can create VPC. Let's create VPC. Okay, so when we are creating a VPC, there are different ways we can do this, right? We can create VPC and more. We can use this option, which is a simpler option, right? And it gets the work done, right? Or we can create VPC alone. So once we create VPC alone, we need to now start creating other resources, right? You are building, then you are creating the private subnet and the private subnet, right? You are doing the necessary associations. After doing that, you want to set up the reception and the resources to be used there, which is the internet gateway. Then you want to proceed to getting your route tables, right? Creating access cards and defining who goes where and all of that. Okay, so now that we have all of that set, so we want to start with the first option, right? Let's look at the first option, which is creating VPC and more, which is set there as default, right? So when you look at this, we can say, oh, let's create a project name. Let's call this number one. Let's call this number one. Number one project, okay? We'll call this number one project. And let's look at this the CIDR block, right? Look at this. We can see the number we have here ends in 16, right? /16. So we can have a range between 16 and 32, right? So this could be 16, it could be 17, it could be 18, it could be 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, or 32. Now, what you'll notice is with 16, see the number of IP addresses that can be generated when you have 16 is as many as 65,536, right? So if you are going through this option of creating Vpc Alone, it lets us know what number of IP address you can generate, right? So because this is the default, right? So you can have 17, right? So you can see the number of IP addresses are reducing. So you can even have 32 here, right? So when you have 32, it means you can only have one IP address, okay, generated. So if you say, let's say, for example, we want to use 20, let's say we want to use 22, right? So with 22, you see that the number of IP addresses we can have is 1024. So there's always this planning stage where you determine what number of IP addresses you need, right? So to determine the number of resources, right? Instead of having all 65,000 plus, right? 65,536 IP addresses, right? So you can just limit it to what you think you need, right? You can limit it to 22, right? So we can have 1,024 IP addresses. You see, 1,024 IP addresses. So that's what we have there. So 1,025 IP addresses. So when we are checking this manually, we won't see this option, right? So there are other ways we can have that sorted out. So apart from having 10 as a prefix, so we can also use 172, okay? So we can use 172. So for this purpose, I want to use 172 because as much as possible, I'll try to create another subnet using the VPC only approach such that we can create a subnet manually and get into all those things that we need to do to have a better understanding of how VPC works, okay? So I can use 172 here, but there's something they call, there's CIDR to IP conversion or calculator. What am I typing? CIDR to IP conversion or calculator. Let's see this. So we can use this first option we see here, CIDR to IP calculator. So looking at this, you can see all this nice stuff that we're able to pick up from here. So you can see that it is possible to actually see how the computation works. CIDR to IP. Okay, let me try a different browser. CIDR to IP address guide. So let me see if I can check this out on a different browser. So let me check this out on a different browser. CIDR to IP. So let's check the conversion. I'm not sure what's wrong with. Okay, let's see this. What's the browser? This is the browser. So let's check this out. So here we can see that we can also do this conversion, right? So for example, let's look at what we are using, right? Let's look at what we are using. That's we are using 172.0.0.0/22. So let's see what we get if we check it out here. Let's see what we get. So let's say we want to calculate the resources. So we can come here and say calculate. So you can see 1,024 hosts, right? So using this. So, as we mentioned earlier, we could also use 10, right? So if we use 10 and we click on calculate, we'll still get the same thing. So for the purpose of this one, we are creating automatically. We want to use 172, okay? So let's calculate. So that's 1,024, okay? Just for us to know that we can actually check this, right? This that we are able to generate automatically, we can also check, okay? So in terms of tenancy, let's see the options here. We want to choose default, right? Because default comes cheaper. Another option would be to choose dedicated, right? So with dedicated, it's more expensive. It means we want it dedicated to us. We select dedicated to ensure that instances launched in this VPC are run on dedicated tenancy, regardless of the tenancy attribute at launch. Okay, so we want to leave it as default, okay, so that we can take advantage of lower cost. Okay, so in terms of availability zones, so let's see what gets created. In terms of availability zones, we can select just one availability zone, okay? So we want it created in US-East-1A. And in terms of public subnet, how many do we want to create? We want to create one subnet, then increase the screen size. You can see we want to create one subnet, private subnet, want to create one public subnet, right? It's like we are placing an order and selecting the options we want. We want to leave this at none and leave this as S3 gateway. Okay, so now that we've done all of this, we want to look at what happens, right? So what happens is this VPC, number one, right? You can see it will create one subnet, two subnets, right? One private, one public within this availability zone. And it will also create how many route tables, right? Route tables. It will create route tables. It will also set up network connections, right? So this is basically what this is going to do for us, okay? This is what we are going to have. So let's take a screenshot of this. So let's take a screenshot of what we are going to have here, sniping. Let's use this to take a screenshot. Let's see what it's going to create for us. So let's create a new. Okay, so just have this for keeps, okay? So after, save it. My downloads. Okay, so that's fine. So this is what is generated for us. It's going to be generated for us where we click on create, right? You see subnets will be created, route tables will be created, right? So remember, the VPC is like the building, the subnet is like the different levels within the building, the public area, the private area. The public area is the area that is available to customers and the employees, and the public area, and the private area is restricted, right, to just the employees, right? So route tables will allow us to move around, right? The route table is like the access card that gives access to these different areas, right? And now to be able to allow the external traffic, right? You need the internet gateway, right? Which is like the reception that allows, receptionist that allows people, outsiders come into the building. Okay, so without talking so much, let's create a VPC. You can see what is being created, all of this, right? Association is done and all of that. So all the good things are done, and we can decide to view, right? So when we view, you see, let's see our VPCs. Let's see VPCs. You can see there's a default that is here, and this is the one that has just been created. And look at what we have, right? This is the CIDR block, right? So let's see what else was created. You can see subnets were created, the public subnet and the private subnet, right? So route tables were also created, right? Route tables were created and internet gateways, right? For an internet gateway was created. Look at this. This is the internet gateway that was created for this particular VPC. You can see the route tables. Let's look at the route tables and try to get something, understand something, because we'll also see what we'll be doing when we start to create this, because we'll try to do this manually as well. So let's take a look at something. You can see the public. Let's see what's happened with the public, right? This is the public. You can see the public has some routing associated with it. So this guy, these are the guys, the public guys that can come in from anywhere and meet the receptionist, that's the internet gateway, to get access to the building, right? And now you see these guys are the employees. These are the local guys. They can move around within the VPC. You can see this is the VPC, right? So you can also see Subnet Association, right? So this is the subnet this route table is associated with, right? A subnet was created, right? So this is the public subnet. So we'll also need to do subnet association when we are creating manually. So subnet association, you can see the routes. So this is the subnet association. So what else? Let's take a look at this subnet, right? You can see what we have here. You can see the subnets. Look at the code, right? 26, but this is 0.0.0. It's similar to what we have under the VPC. We have this one, VPC /22, right? So let's take a look at something. Let's copy this IPv6. Let's copy it and check it out in this browser to try to understand something, okay? So what this means is, with this, 64 resources can be created, right? So that's the assumption. 64 resources can be created here, right? So we can create up to 256, right? Depending on what we are trying to achieve. But this one that was automatically created 64, right? So what this means is that of all the resources we have, right? Remember, we said we put 22, right? This is what we put for the VPC to give us 1024, right? So 64 out of the 1024 has been used for that public subnet, okay? So that's what we've used for the public subnet. Let me refresh this. Okay, so now let's go back to that. So I just wanted you to look at this, right? So usually when you are trying to create another subnet, right, you cannot replicate this, right? Because if you replicate this, it tells you that it's been used before, right? So let's take a look at what we have under the other guy. Under the private, let's see the private. Look at the private. So you can see with the private, you can see it's only restricted to those within the organization, right? You can see there's no traffic from outside. There's no connection to the internet gateway, right? These guys can just go in using their access card to get into the appropriate office they need to get into, right? An employee does not need to go to the reception to get access to his office, right? So that's the way it works. So let's look at the Subnet Association. I want to show you something. You can see right here, for the private, yeah, something changed, right? We still maintain something similar, right? But instead of using 0 here, we use 2, right? Why are we able to use 2? We didn't use 1, we just jumped to 2. It's possible to use 2 because there are still many resources available, right? Between 1 and 64. So after that, you still have as many as 6, let's say, if you have 1,000 and let's use a calculator so that to be clearer, calculator. If we say we have, let me move the calculator to the other screen. Okay, so this is the calculator. Okay, so this is the calculator. Remember, we said we had 1,024, right? And with this last 26, right, we were able to see that 26 will give you 64 resources, right? 64, right? 64. Let's say 64. So what it means is that we can have as many as 16 here, right? Can have, initially it was 0.0, we can have 0.1, we can have 0.2, up to 0.15, right? Because we have 16, we can have as many as 16, right? Of 64s, if you are using this without it conflicting, okay? So anyway, the next example we are going to create manually, I'm going to do something to make us understand this concept better. Okay, now that we've created this is fine. Let's try to create it manually this time around, right? Right now we have, let's see the VPCs we have. This is the defaults that came when we created the account. Now this is the one we just created automatically. That's the number 1. So we'll try to create another VPC, right? But this time around, we'll try to use the VPC only option, right? Remember, when we're creating the other time, we used 172.0.0.0/22. This time around, I want to use, let's say 10.0.0.0, let's say /24. What does this /24 give us? Let's see. Copy. If we copy this and we come in here, let's go to the other browser where we check. So we'll come in here, let's put this here and calculate. Okay, we see that with this, we are able to create 256, right? 256. How many do I want to create? I want to create more than 256. Let's explore our options. Let's try to create, let's try 23. If we try 23, you see that we can have 512 IP addresses, okay? So this is what I want to use. So I want to use 23, right? So let me copy this. I want to copy this. So I want to be able to create as many as 512 IP addresses. You notice something with this, we do not have that luxury where the system tells us the number of IP addresses that has been created, right? So everything is manual. So we just need to figure it out ourselves. Okay, so and that's what we are doing. So 23. So tenancy, I want to leave this as default. So what name do I want to call this? I want to call this number 2, right? The first one was number 1, right? Let's call this number 2, okay? So I want to call this number 2. Let me create my VPC. So as simple as that, but this time around, we are not getting everything ready-made. We are trying to create the VPC, we'll create our subnet, right? Now you can see, if we check our VPC, let's see what we have. We have the default. This is the one that was created earlier, right? And look at what we have here. This is the one we created now, right? With 512, with the option to create 512 IP addresses, right? This is the one we just created now. So let me rename this so that it can look similar to what we have down there. Number 2 VPC, okay? So this is one we just created. So if we check subnet, you see that we have subnet for number 1, subnet for number 1, right? But do we have anything? We have public subnet for number 1, and we have private subnets. Let's look at it, right? We have private subnet and we have public subnet for number 1. We do not have anything for number 2 yet. So what do we need to do? We need to create, right? We need to create a subnet, right? We need to create subnets for number 2 that we just created now. So you can see this doesn't get automatically created. We need to also go ahead and do it manually. So now we've built the house. Now we need to separate the house into that area that we want restricted and the area that we do not want restricted. So we are trying to create a private subnet and a public subnet. So let's see what we can do. So number 2 subnet public, okay? So let's say subnet. We want to associate this with what VPC? Is it default? No. Is it number 1? No. This time around is number 2, okay? So this is the one we are working on. So this is number 2. This is the IPv4 CIDRs, okay? So this is what we have. So I want to come here. What name do I want to call this? I want to call this number 2 dash subnet dash, let's call this public, right? Let's call this public, right? I want to call this public. Remember, this time around, our CIDR block format, you can see the way it is, right? Do you want to use 70? Do you want to use 172 here? If you use 172, it's not going to work because it doesn't match what we are trying to associate it with, okay? So there are different kinds of blocks, okay? So you want to stick to the block type you have. Now, what do we do? If we go ahead and utilize this, you see what I copied from up there? What it means is that if you go ahead and say, oh, we want to use this as CIDR block, what are the challenges we are going to have, right? Creating subnets with this, right? Exactly the way it looks. So the challenges we are going to have will include, 1, if you come, it's like taking the entire host, right? The 23, it means you want to create everything under public. So there's no room for creating private because you've utilized everything possible, right? So that is not something we want to do, okay? So we want to create something less. Remember, when we were looking at the one that was automatically generated, it generated 64 hosts, right, per subnet, right? But this time around, I want to generate something more, right, just to show us certain challenges we might have when we are practicing this on our own, okay? So let's say we want to use 24. So if we use 24, for example, let's click on calculate. You see that we can have 256 hosts, right? 256 IP addresses. So what it means is that if we utilize 256 IP addresses for this particular private public subnet, it means there'll still be 256 left that can be used for the other subnets, right? So let's use 24, right? Instead of what we copied from up there. So once you use 24, right? So what it means is that for this VPC, there is 512 hosts, right? IP addresses that can be created. So of the entire 512, for this subnet that we are creating, right? This public subnet that we are creating under number 2, we want to make sure that 256 IP addresses can be created here. Okay, so once we establish that, we want to click on create subnet. Okay, so this subnet has been created, right? So we'll come back to it. So let's see how we can create the second subnet, right? We want to create the second subnet and associate it with the same number 2 VPC, right? So this time around, we want to call this number 2 subnet. We want to call this private, right? The first one we created was public, right? We want to call this private. This is the private subnet. So preference, so let the system generate an availability zone for us. So are we going to use this exactly? If we use this exactly, right? The result we are going to get is that, oh, there's an overlap because this particular string has been used by the public subnet, okay? So let's see what we get. You see, what we'll see is an error message saying that this has been used, right? So this address overlaps with an existing subnet, right? Because this is exactly what we use, right? So, and remember, we are trying to achieve the use of, let me show you something. We want to utilize the remaining 256, right? So what it means is that in generating these IP addresses, what would have happened is that when the IP addresses are created, we would have got 10.0.0.0, they would have got 10.0.0.1, 10.0.0.2, 10.0.0.3, up to 255, right? Because 256 IPs are to be created there, right? So when it gets to 255, right, what happens is that it starts at 1 again, right? This part will change to 1, right? 1, right? Then it starts 10.0.1, 10.0.1.0, 10.0.1.1, 10.0.1.2, 10.0.1.3, till it gets to 10.0.1.255, right? So when it gets to that level, you realize that the initial 56 has been utilized and the next 56 has been utilized. So there's no more resource here to be utilized, okay? So, but what happens, right? If I say, oh, remember when we checked the one that was created automatically, for the private, it didn't use 0.1, it used 0.2. What happens if I say 0.2? Remember, based on the calculation we did now, the initial 256 has been exhausted by public, and using 0.1, we've also utilized the next 256, making sure that the entire 512 resources that we created is gone. But what happens if we put 0.2 here? If we put 0.2, it won't work. It will tell us that, oh, this is outside the range, right? Let's see what it tells us. You see, this address is not within the CIDR address, right? Because the total resource that we have under this, right? Looking at this, look at this, right? Is 512, right? 512. Let's see. You can see that's 23. Look at it. We can only create 512 IP addresses, right? So, and for the first public, we use this, right? And we've utilized how many? 256. So what we are doing next is to utilize the next 256, right? If you click on this, you see, tells us another 256 has been used, right? So if you still click on point 2, it means another 256. So these are possibilities, right? If you click on this, it means 256 as well, right? But we do not have that luxury to get up to this point because the total we even have within the environment is 512. So what we can use is 10.0.0 points, right? To use our first 256, right? Then to use the next 256, we needed to specify this, right? So because we do not have more than 512, can we go on and on? No, we can only use 10.0.0.0 and 10.0.0.1, 10.0.1.0. So those are the two we can use to utilize everything we have available to us. But what if we were looking at the first example, right? Under auto, right? So they could afford to use 10.0.172.0.2 or 0.3 because it's just 64, right? And they have as many as 1,024 to use, okay? But in our own case, we have a total of 512. We've used 256, and we can only use the balance of 256 using this, okay? So that is what we have been able to achieve with this. So when you are practicing on your own and you start to see these interesting error messages, you know where it's coming from. So because we only have access to do another 256, we don't have more than 512, so we want to stick to this, okay? So once we have this, we can create a subnet, okay? So we've created the second subnet, okay? So now let's check our subnet. Let's see what we have. So you can see we have 4 subnets, right? We have 2 that were automatically created, and they relate to number 1 project. And these are the 2 that we created ourselves, right? You can see 10.0.1.0, right? And the public is 10.0.0.0, right? So the one that was created automatically, you can see the public 172.0.0.0/26 because it's just 64. This 26 gives you access to create 64 resources, right? To store IP addresses. So they could afford to move to point 2 because this guy skipped point 1, right? Because there's still enough room. So they can wiggle around, right? So it doesn't have to follow a particular order. But in my own case, because at 24, I'm using 256 resources. So the remaining 256 resources has to be picked from point 1 because there's just a little wiggle room for me to play with, okay? So these are some of the things we should take note of, okay? So we can see this because we didn't select an availability zone, it has created it for us in East 1D, okay? So that's that. So what else are we going to look at, right? We've looked at the building, that's the VPC. We've looked at the different divisions within the building, the private area, the restricted area, and the public area, giving us the private subnet and the public subnet. So what next are we going to look at? We want to look at the access cards, how to get into different places, right? Looking at route tables. But before we go to route tables, let's look at the internet gateways. That's the reception, right? The receptionist at the reception, and their phone resources they use to contact the offices. Oh, Mr. X, you have somebody here to see you. Can the person come in, you know? So let's look at the internet gateway, which is the reception in this our scenario, in this our description. So we want to come here and look at internet gateways. So this is the one created automatically, right? This is the one that came by default. Let me call this default. Okay, let's call this default. And let's create an internet gateway. So let's create our own internet gateway. So in creating an internet gateway, we can call this, let's see how that one was named. So we can be consistent. Number 1 -IGW internet gateway. So let's create this as number 2 -IGW. Okay, so let's create our gateway. Number 2 -IGW. Number 2 -IGW internet gateway. Okay, so that's the name. So it's as easy as this. We create our internet gateway. So we set up the reception. So what do we want to do, right? If you look at this, it doesn't show it's attached to anything, right? It's detached. But we want to associate this internet gateway to a VPC. Now, what VPC are we looking at? The VPC that does not have internet gateway is the number 2 VPC, right? So we want to associate this. So we attach internet gateway. So that's all we need to do with that. So we've created our reception, right? This is the internet gateway within the building, okay? So now that we have this, we want to go to the route tables, right? Now let's look at the naming convention. So the route table, before we create ours, let's take a look at what we have with the public route table. Let's see the public route table. You can see this is the public route table. There's a public route table for number 1 project, and there's a private route table. So the public route table has something interesting. Look at this. This is the local, right? So all the employees that come into the building, they have their respective access cards, so they can go to their offices and gain access to get work done, right? You can see this relates to the VPC, right? So everybody within the VPC can go to use their access card to move around. Whereas people from the outside, what do they need? People coming from everywhere, they need to get in using the internet gateway. They need to talk to the receptionist to be able to get the visitors tag, right? So this is it, right? We also see routes. Let's see subnet associations, right? This is the public. You see it's associated with the public subnets, right? You can see this relates to the public subnets. So I just want you to look at that so that when we are creating us, we also know what to do, right? So let's look at the private route table, because we are trying to create our own route tables now. So private route tables, let's see what we have with that. You can see subnet association. What is it associated with? To be associated with the private subnet, okay? You can see it's associated with the private subnet. Let's see the routes. So these guys, these local guys, they don't need any, they just need to use their access card to move around. So you can see we do not allow anybody in here from outside, right? You can see there's no access to outsiders using the internet gateway as we add under the public, right? So now, since we've taken note of this, let's go ahead and create our own route tables and set it up appropriately. Okay, so we create route table. We want to call this number 2 -RTB, route table dash public. Let's call this the public, right? Public. Okay, but 2 route table. So what VPC do you want to use for this route table? Definitely is going to be this. So as simple as this, we create the route table, the public route table. So what do we want to do once we've created the public route table? You can see by default, it's associated with that VPC that we linked it to, okay? So this is for that VPC that we created, right? So we want to, this is the public, right? So for the public, what do you want to do? We want to allow outsiders to be able to go through the reception, the internet gateway, to get access, right? So we want to add edit routes, okay, and allow 000 from anywhere, right? 0.0.0.0/0 from anywhere using the internet gateway. Which of the internet gateway? The number 2, right? Okay, so we want to save changes. So once we do this, we also want to go to Subnet Associations, right? Click on Subnet Association. So this is the public, right? Public, we want to associate it with the public subnet, right? So edit Subnet Association, right? We want to associate it with the number 2 public subnet, right? Remember? Subnet, right? Remember this, okay? So we want to save this association. So you've associated it with public subnet. So you can see we've done exactly what was done with the one that was created automatically. So we always use that as guide, right? So that we don't miss our way. Okay, so we've created the public route table. So what else do we want to create? We want to create the private route table. So let's create route table. Let's create number 2 RTB private. Okay, so we want to create the private route table. So there's the public. So let's create the private now. So create route table. That's number 2 RTB dash private. So I want to create the private route table. So we want to associate it with number 2. Okay. So once we do this, we want to create route table, as easy as that. So the next thing we are going to do, we'll leave this the way it is. We don't want public access. So we want to do our subnet association. So we want to edit Subnet Association and add the private subnet, right? So private subnets will be attached to the private route table. Okay, save association, and we are good. Okay, so let's look at the route tables and compare what we have. You can see this route table, public, right? We have it associated. Let's see what's associated with public to public, right? Just as the one that was automatically created. So this shows us that we've done everything right, right? So you can see public to public, public to public, private to private, private to private. This is one we created, right? Number 2, number 2. Okay. So what else? So you can see number 2, number 1, number 1, number 2. Okay. So we've done everything right. Yeah. So we have our VPC number 2, which is created. So look at the state, available, available. We have our CIDR block. So everything is all set, right? No, you see, everything is in order. So this is a way we know that, oh, we've done it right. In case you are checking, you see, we've checked the subnets available, right? So subnets available. So you can see everything we have, available IP addresses. You can see what we have. So this is what we've been able to achieve. You can see the route tables, right? Remember, we checked out the associations, right? And see the associations that we have. No. Okay, so everything is looking good. And we also have the internet gateways, right? And they are all attached. So with this, we come to an end of VPC. And if there are questions pertaining to creating resources, you can send in your messages using the channels that we have. Thank you. See you in another session. Bye for now.